Andrew Grayson had never planned on raising a child, let alone stepping into the role of full-time guardian to his sister's 12-year-old son, Ben. Yet here he was, standing on the porch of a modest rental home in the quiet suburb of Lamont Hills, with a set of borrowed keys in one hand and a to-do list longer than any work order he'd ever signed. As a journeyman electrician with a steady but unremarkable income, he wasn't anyone's idea of a traditional caretaker, least of all his own. But family wasn't something you weighed against convenience. When his sister called, voice low and urgent, saying she needed to leave town indefinitely for a consulting project overseas, he didn't hesitate. He picked up Ben that same evening and promised the boy that things would be okay, even if he wasn't entirely sure what that meant. Lamont Hills wasn't luxurious, but it had that curated suburban gloss that made outsiders believe it was a place of clean streets and predictable days. Manicured hedges, evenly spaced trees, and polite nods from strangers created an illusion of order that Andrew found both comforting and artificial. He didn't care for picket fences or bake sales, but he figured this would be a decent place for Ben to settle. Safe, quiet, and far from the noise of the city where both of them had grown tired of dodging real and imagined dangers. The house itself was basic. 1 story, 2 bedrooms, faint smell of old carpet masked with lemon-scented cleaner. But it had a backyard, a working stove, and room for a kid's bike in the garage. It would do. The neighbors were involved. From the moment they arrived, people introduced themselves in waves. An older man named Harold came bearing a plastic-wrapped cherry pie and questions about Ben's schooling. A woman in a beige cardigan appeared the next morning offering to mow the lawn. Though Andrew hadn't yet unpacked the mower from the truck, 2 others stopped by within the week. One delivering a welcome brochure listing community expectations, and another handing over a binder labeled Lamont Hills Code of Conduct. None of them explicitly said the words Homeowners Association, and Andrew assumed it was just a tightly knit community. After all, he was renting. None of this really applied to him, or so he thought. Ben, ever quiet since the move, seemed more at ease here. He rode his bike in loops around the cul-de-sac, traded Pokemon cards with a boy down the street, and helped Andrew unpack boxes in exchange for extra dessert. Andrew watched him closely in those early days, trying to catch signs of how the boy was coping. He knew the transition hadn't been easy. Ben's parents had left in a rush, and though Andrew had reassured him it was temporary, the kid wasn't dumb. He understood the weight of silence, the unspoken questions hanging in every room, but for a while, things seemed almost normal. That changed the morning Andrew found the flyer taped to his front door. It was printed on thick, cream-colored paper with an embossed seal at the top. Lamont Hills Residential Standards Committee. He flipped it over. The language was vague but firm, referencing observed deviations from neighborhood protocol and requesting his presence at an informal meeting to ensure alignment with community values. It was signed without a name, just a flourish and the title, Community Coordinator. Andrew frowned, reading it twice before setting it aside. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the previous tenant had racked up some neighborly complaints. He didn't know, and he didn't particularly care. He wasn't the kind of man who responded well to passive-aggressive notes, and he sure as hell didn't plan to attend some unannounced gathering with strangers who thought polite coercion was the same as authority. But Ben found it interesting. He asked if the committee was like student council, and if they'd be serving snacks. Andrew just chuckled and told him to worry about his spelling test instead. Yet, somewhere in the back of his mind, something about that flyer stuck with him, like a nail beneath fresh paint, hidden but sharp. It wasn't the content. It was the tone. It didn't sound like a suggestion. It sounded like a warning. It began with something so mundane, so forgettable, that Andrew didn't even realize it was the moment everything tilted. Ben didn't come home from school. At first, Andrew wasn't alarmed. There had been talk that morning of a class project, and Ben had mentioned staying after with a few other kids. Andrew remembered vaguely nodding as he tied his boots for a job downtown, distracted by a malfunctioning breaker he was supposed to fix. He had told Ben to text if he'd be late, but by 5 o'clock there was no message, and when Andrew called, the call went straight to voicemail. It wasn't until 6 that the discomfort turned into something heavier, something with a cold edge that settled beneath his ribs. He called the school, but the front office had already closed. He called 2 of the kids Ben had mentioned, numbers listed in the emergency contact file, but one didn't pick up and the other hadn't seen Ben since last period. A thin sheen of panic began to surface, but Andrew fought it down. He drove to the school himself, found the parking lot empty, the lights already dimmed, the janitor locking up. The man shrugged and said kids sometimes left with other parents. Maybe he caught a ride, he offered with a careless wave. You know how they are. Andrew didn't. The moment he got back to the house, the first thing he noticed was the small white envelope tucked between the screen door and the frame, just like the flyer before it, with no stamp or name, only the seal and the words, Notice of Non-Compliance. Minor ward infraction. It was printed in the same serif font, professional but unnerving, the kind of tone that made your skin itch. Inside was a single page with templated language. Your dependent minor, Benjamin Grayson, has been observed engaging in unsanctioned roaming during the school-designated hours. As per the protocol outlined in the Residential Youth Safety Initiative, he has been temporarily relocated to a behavioral review site for orientation and corrective feedback. Guardians may submit formal inquiries within the designated window posted at the committee office. Andrew read the paragraph twice before his brain could even accept what the words were trying to convey. Relocated, orientation, corrective feedback. It sounded like a daycare memo written by a sociopath. At first, he thought it had to be a prank, maybe some dark, deranged HOA humor he didn't understand. But his gut told him otherwise. He checked the entire house, opened every closet, called Ben's name even though he already knew there'd be no response. He stood in the middle of the living room and tried to steady his breathing, but his thoughts were fracturing like thin ice under weight. Someone had taken Ben. They had taken him, and they'd left a letter like it was part of the lease agreement. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. It rang once, then twice, then disconnected. He tried again. The same result. On the third attempt, the call connected, but the line was silent. No dispatcher, no static, just the sound of his own breathing amplified back at him. Then a click. Then nothing. He stared at the screen, then at the bars in the corner. Full signal. No outage, no storm, just silence. He called again, but this time the call didn't even attempt to go through. Instead, his phone vibrated with a notification. Your service access is temporarily restricted. Please contact your local administrator. Administrator? What administrator? That's when the doorbell rang. He froze. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he walked slowly to the front window and peeked through the blinds. 3 people stood on his porch, Harold with the pie, the woman in the cardigan, and a man Andrew hadn't seen before, tall, gray-suited, with a calm expression and an unreadable smile. Harold waved. The woman clutched what looked like a clipboard. Andrew opened the door but didn't step out. "Where's my nephew?" he asked immediately. His voice was low but sharp. The man in the suit smiled wider. "Mr. Grayson, there's no need to escalate. Everything is proceeding according to regulation. Benjamin is under care. He is safe, receiving guided intervention designed to foster positive communal alignment." The words felt rehearsed, like he was reading from an internal manual. Andrew didn't care. "You took a child," he snapped. "You kidnapped my nephew. Where is he? I want to see him. Now." The woman clicked her pen against the clipboard, not looking up. Non-compliance with minor ward protocols is a first-tier infraction. Visitation is deferred pending review. Andrew stared at them, dumbfounded. "You don't have the right to hold him. This is a goddamn felony." The man in the suit tilted his head sympathetically, as if hearing the wrong note in a familiar song. "Mr. Grayson, I understand your anxiety. It's common among new arrivals, but you're operating under outdated legal assumptions. Lamont Hills is governed by a chartered civic alignment framework. Your tenancy agreement includes voluntary submission to community-oriented development procedures. It's all very standard." Andrew didn't know whether to scream or laugh. "You mean the lease I signed for this place? That's what gives you the right to detain a child." The man didn't flinch. "Everything is documented. You'll find the Clause 14b under the Resident Integration Appendix." Andrew slammed the door without saying another word. He locked the deadbolt, then the chain. His hands were shaking as he backed away from the entrance. He didn't understand any of this, how a quiet neighborhood could suddenly erupt into some bureaucratic nightmare with its own language and enforcement. It didn't feel real, and yet it felt too precise to be a prank. He wanted to call the police again, drive to the sheriff's station, bang on the desk until someone listened, but the idea of leaving the house without knowing where Ben was made his skin crawl. Instead, he turned back to the envelope and read it again, focusing on one phrase he had missed before. "Committee office. Access hours 7 to 1900, behind parcel drop site number 4. He didn't know what parcel drop site number 4 was. But he was going to find out, and if that's where they had his nephew, then he was going to get him back, whatever this place, this committee, this entire fabricated authority thought they were. Because this wasn't a game or regulation. This was abduction. And Andrew wasn't going to ask politely. Andrew didn't sleep that night. He didn't even try. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the unreadable notice for hours, replaying every second of the conversation with the suited man and the clipboard woman, trying to analyze tone, posture, anything that might have given away a hint of where Ben could be. Around 3 a.m, he started drawing a map of the neighborhood on a piece of scrap paper. He marked the locations of houses he'd visited, the intersections he passed daily, and then started listing places that could fit the cryptic description of parcel drop site number 4. By the time the sun began rising behind the pale clouds, he had circled an area near the edge of the neighborhood, a small cul-de-sac where deliveries seemed to be routed through communal boxes. It was the only location that made any kind of logistical sense, but even so it felt absurd. The idea that his missing nephew might be hidden behind a cluster of mailboxes was insane on its face, and yet this entire neighborhood was operating on an axis tilted away from normalcy. He couldn't ignore the pattern: polite absurdity, package threats, soft language hiding steel enforcement. He left the house at 6:45, walking instead of driving. He didn't want to draw attention, though he had no idea what counted as attention here anymore. Every motion now felt loaded. He passed 2 joggers who didn't look at him, and a woman walking a dog who smiled too quickly and too widely. The mailbox structure loomed up at the end of the street, standard beige panels embedded into a short concrete wall surrounded by manicured shrubs and a wooden bench. There was a maintenance shed nearby, locked, but beside it stood a nondescript door with a keypad above the handle and a bronze plaque that read simply, "Committee." The design was too polished to be makeshift. Someone had built this intentionally, integrated it with the suburban landscape so seamlessly that anyone walking by would never think twice. Andrew waited until the clock on his phone ticked past 7 o'clock. Then he walked up to the door and pressed the call button beside the keypad. It buzzed once, then unlocked without a word. He stepped inside. The room wasn't large. Bare walls, fluorescent lighting, and a single reception desk manned by a young woman who didn't look older than 20, dressed in a pressed tan uniform with a small silver badge that said, "Compliance Liaison." She looked up as he entered, smiling like she'd been expecting him. "Mr. Grayson," she said calmly, "please take a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." He didn't move. "Where is Ben?" he asked, his voice sharp but measured. Her smile didn't fade. "He's undergoing an orientation cycle which typically lasts 48 hours. He's not in danger. Your concern is noted." Andrew took a breath and stepped closer to the desk. "I didn't authorize any of this. I never agreed to your whatever this is. I want him released now." Her expression shifted slightly. Less warmth, more professionalism. "You authorized community compliance procedures by taking residency under Section 14. Community minors are subject to behavioral calibration under emergent conditions. Non-participation results in delayed reintegration." She said it like she was reading it off a card. Andrew clenched his fists. But before he could respond, a door opened at the far end of the room, and the man from the porch, the suited figure, emerged again, still calm, still composed, hands folded neatly in front of him. "Mr. Grayson," he said as if greeting an old acquaintance. "Let's step into my office, shall we?" Andrew hesitated, but followed. The office was strangely empty. No desk, no chairs, just a soft gray floor, muted walls, and a single glass panel on one side. It wasn't until the man motioned toward it that Andrew realized it was a one-way window. Behind it, barely visible through the tinted pane, was a long room with several tables, low shelves, and 4 children seated at individual stations. One of them was Ben. He was seated upright, focused on some kind of touchscreen in front of him. An older woman in a white polo stood nearby, nodding at intervals. Andrew stepped forward, pressing his hand against the glass. "What is this?" he asked. "Why is he in there?" The man didn't answer immediately. "We found that corrective alignment works best through cognitive modeling and routine reinforcement. Benjamin has responded well so far. His empathy indexes are normalizing. He's quiet, observant, willing to mirror authority. That's a good sign." Andrew turned, his face twisted in disbelief. "He's a kid, not a test subject." The man smiled faintly. "We don't think in those terms. We think in outcomes, cohesion, long-term behavioral viability." Andrew's patience snapped. He turned toward the door, but 2 figures had already appeared outside, blocking the exit. Not armed, not threatening, just there. The suited man continued, his tone unchanging. "You'll be given access to your Guardian Reinforcement module later this afternoon. In the meantime, we recommend reviewing the handbook. It'll help you better contextualize your role as a compliance facilitator." Andrew didn't respond. He stared through the glass again, watching Ben pick up a puzzle piece and hesitate before placing it. Something about the boy's posture was off. Not afraid exactly, but restrained, like someone tiptoeing on an invisible line they didn't fully understand. He was escorted out without resistance. The woman at the desk handed him a manila envelope marked "Integration Materials" and wished him a pleasant day. As he stepped back into the sun, the sounds of sprinklers and birdsong felt jarring, as if the entire neighborhood was mocking him with its choreographed calm. He walked home slowly, the envelope tucked under his arm, still unopened. Once inside, he tore it open, not out of trust, but desperation. Inside were printed pages, charts, and a laminated card that read, "Probationary Guardian, Level 2." There was no further explanation. He sat down, trying to process the weight of what he had just seen, but his thoughts were fractured, logic slipping between the cracks of an impossible reality. Then there was a knock at the back door, 3 quick taps, followed by silence. He stood slowly, moved to the kitchen, and opened the curtain. Outside stood one of his neighbors, a quiet woman named Lorraine, always seen watering her rose bushes. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She just looked at him wide-eyed and said, "If you want to keep him, you need to stop asking questions. Just do what they say. They let me see mine again. Eventually." Then she turned and walked away. And Andrew, standing in his own home with a card that meant nothing and an envelope full of veiled threats, realized he was part of something he hadn't agreed to, something larger, older, and far more coordinated than a simple neighborhood committee. He wasn't sure if it was legal or even real in the way institutions normally were, but it had rules, enforcers, protocols, and worst of all, it had Ben. The following 48 hours passed in a state of taut, suspended dread, a kind of waking paralysis where time both crawled and collapsed in on itself. Andrew did not sleep, not in any real sense. He dozed with the lights on, fully dressed, the laminated probationary guardian card still lying untouched on the kitchen table like a threat he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Every sound outside, garbage trucks, children's laughter, the metallic jangle of wind chimes, took on a surreal, distorted quality, like they were part of a film projected just for him, designed to unnerve without escalating. The neighbors, once overly friendly, now avoided eye contact. They didn't retreat entirely. Instead, they hovered at the edges of visibility, always there but never present, like background actors who knew when to step off stage. The roses in Lorraine's yard were pruned more precisely than ever. The man who used to wave from his porch now stood completely still each time Andrew passed, holding a coffee cup that never seemed to empty, staring ahead as though he'd been paused mid-thought. By the third morning, Andrew's resolve broke through the fog of exhaustion. He was done waiting for permission, done parsing semantics in laminated cards and hollow pamphlets. He needed to see Ben, and he needed to understand, truly, concretely, what this place was and what it had done to them. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about the basic architecture of power, who held it, how they used it, and why. Armed with nothing but a crowbar he retrieved from the garage, he returned to the committee door just after sunrise. He didn't expect it to be open, but it was. Unlocked, unguarded, its keypad glowing faintly green as if in silent invitation. The reception area was empty. No liaison, no guards. Just fluorescent light humming and the faint scent of citrus disinfectant in the air. He walked through cautiously, retracing his steps from the last visit, but this time he pushed past the side hallway he hadn't noticed before. What he found was not a corridor of offices or classrooms. It was a series of rooms partitioned by glass, like display cases in a modern museum. Inside each one were children, 4, maybe 5 at most, engaged in quiet, structured activities. Drawing, typing, sitting still. Each child wore a slate-gray vest, the same kind Ben had worn through the glass during Andrew's last visit. And each room was supervised by an adult who barely interacted with the child, instead tapping at a tablet, adjusting dials on the wall, or simply observing with an intensity that made Andrew's stomach turn. It wasn't abuse in the traditional sense. There were no raised voices, no restraints. But the effect was worse in some ways. It was clinical, calculated, a deliberate orchestration of control disguised as education. He kept walking until he saw Ben. His nephew was sitting cross-legged in a square, padded area, silently stacking blocks with methodical precision. His movements were too deliberate, too practiced. There was no curiosity, no playfulness. Each block placed atop the other like he was following an invisible blueprint. A woman stood behind him, muttering something into a headset. Andrew pressed his hand against the glass. "Ben," he said, loud enough to echo. The boy looked up. For a split second, his face flickered with recognition, then fear, and then, just as quickly, neutral compliance. He turned back to the blocks. Before Andrew could act, someone grabbed his arm. It wasn't a violent grip, but it was firm, purposeful. A man in a navy sweater with no badge, no name. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, voice low and almost apologetic. "You're violating transition protocol. This puts your guardianship in jeopardy." Andrew yanked his arm free. "He's my family. You people took him. I'm not walking away." The man didn't argue. He merely gestured back toward the exit. "Come with me. I'll show you something." Andrew followed, not because he trusted him, but because he sensed something different in this one. The man didn't have the same mechanical calm, the same curated language. He seemed tired, frayed at the edges. They passed back through the hallway and entered a stairwell that led down to a sublevel Andrew didn't know existed. The walls here were unpainted concrete. The lights dimmed slightly as they descended, casting long shadows across the metal steps. The man paused at a door marked Archival. Inside, the room smelled of dust and static. Old filing cabinets lined the walls, and against the far end stood a console with multiple monitors, all dark. The man didn't speak immediately. He walked to a filing cabinet, pulled out a thick binder, and handed it to Andrew. "This place was never meant to be like this," he said. "It started as a pilot, one of a dozen. Behavioral cohesion testing, family integration metrics, localized compliance modeling. The people who started it don't live here. They never intended to. They monitor, they adjust, they profit. They call it civic evolution." Andrew flipped through the binder. Pages of metrics. Reports labeled Child Adaptability Index, Guardian Stability Forecast, Non-Compliance Event Logs. Some of the entries had names next to them, others just numbers. And, near the middle, his name, Ben's name, a detailed psychological profile, behavioral triggers, stress responses. "They've been watching us," Andrew muttered, feeling the words stick in his throat. The man nodded. "Since you signed the lease, probably before that. You were a high-value variable. Blue-collar, no legal counsel, newly assigned minor, easy to control, easy to fold into the model." Andrew slammed the binder shut. "How do I get him out?" The man sighed. "You can't pull him by force. The kids are conditioned. If they sense disruption, they default to withdrawal. They freeze, sometimes permanently. The only way they release a minor is through full program graduation or guardian substitution." Andrew didn't understand. "What substitution?" The man looked away. "You trade your place for theirs. You become the compliance participant. They go free. You don't." Silence stretched between them. Andrew stepped back overwhelmed. The weight of the situation was now tangible, pressing on every breath. There were no phone calls to make, no authorities to report to. This system existed outside of reach, woven through legal gray zones and corporate abstraction. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked finally. The man hesitated. "Because my daughter's in room 12, and I've been here too long to remember what day it is. I made the substitution. I thought it was the only way. Now I'm just part of the walls." Andrew didn't ask for his name. He left the archive without another word, walking back through the quiet corridors, past the children in their performance boxes, past the liaison at the front desk who didn't even glance up as he left. The sky outside had clouded over, dull and indifferent. The sidewalks glistened faintly, though it hadn't rained. Something in the air felt heavy, like the silence before a blackout. That evening, he sat on the living room floor, surrounded by files he had stolen from the archive. Every profile, every chart, every observation protocol, he read them all. He didn't understand the jargon, but he understood the intent. This wasn't governance. It wasn't education. It was ownership. Modular, psychological, procedural ownership of people packaged in the aesthetics of suburban order. Ben had become a variable in someone's experiment, and Andrew had been tagged for containment the moment he crossed the threshold into Lamont Hills. But now he had seen the machine from the inside, and now the machine had seen him too. Andrew knew from the moment he stepped outside that he couldn't keep pretending to function as a passive participant in whatever system he and Ben had been swallowed into. The illusion of civility had cracked beyond repair, and with it any lingering belief that this could be handled through polite confrontation or legal protest evaporated completely. He spent the next day and a half gathering supplies in the most inconspicuous way he could manage, buying water filters, matches, a second prepaid phone, an emergency radio, non-perishable food, and heavy-duty locks that he installed along the back. Windows under cover of night. The HOA-style notices hadn't stopped arriving. If anything, they escalated in tone, always phrased in that sickly formal language that sounded like help but read like warning. One envelope, slightly heavier than the rest, contained a laminated family compliance checklist that now included biometric feedback expectations, guardian morning affirmation logs, and mandatory participation in something called the Civic Observation Exchange. None of it made sense. All of it sounded like they were getting closer to folding him into something permanent. The strange thing was, he still hadn't seen Ben again. Not directly, not in the open. But the neighborhood had started reacting to him differently, as if it knew he'd passed some invisible threshold. The smiles were gone. Now it was nods, slight and mechanical. The neighbor with the empty coffee cup stopped pretending to drink. Lorraine no longer watered the roses. Children weren't in the yards anymore, not even the ones he'd seen before. It was as if the entire block had slipped into a different mode, an alternate setting designed for containment. Even the air felt thinner. Then, one night, it happened. A knock at the door, 4 precise taps, evenly spaced. Andrew didn't answer. He stood off to the side, holding the crowbar like a lifeline, watching through the peephole. Outside stood the suited man again, his hands clasped in front of him like a politician awaiting applause. Beside him was another figure, a young girl, maybe 11, with that same blank posture Andrew had seen in Ben. She held a clipboard with a seal embossed at the top. Field Feedback Initiative. The man raised his voice slightly, though not enough to alarm anyone else on the street. Mr. Grayson, tonight we're conducting a guardian compliance spot review. No participation will be noted as passive resistance. Refusal will be logged. Andrew said nothing. He didn't move. After a few moments, the man reached into his coat and produced a small envelope, which he slid under the door. Then he left, the girl following precisely 1 pace behind. When the sound of their footsteps faded, Andrew picked up the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed in the now familiar serif font. This time there were no explanations. Only one line of text. Ben has advanced to Phase 2. Withdrawal is no longer reversible. The words struck like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, the envelope slipping from his fingers. He didn't sleep that night. Again. He sat by the back door, crowbar across his lap, eyes fixed on the motion detector that now blinked erratically for no clear reason. In the early hours of the morning, just as the streetlights were powering down, he heard a soft scratching near the garage. He moved silently, heart pounding, and peered through the narrow side window. A figure, small, crouched, was fiddling with something at the base of the siding. Not a saboteur, not an agent of the committee. It was a boy. At first, he thought it might be Ben. The size, the stillness, it matched. But when the figure turned toward the movement of the curtain, Andrew saw a different face, one he didn't recognize. Pale, smudged, scared. The boy dropped something and ran. Andrew rushed outside, barefoot, chasing him across the street. The kid vanished behind Lorraine's yard and through a gap in the fence, gone like vapor. But on the ground, half buried under mulch, was what he had dropped. A spiral notebook, warped from water damage, pages thick and curling at the edges. Andrew picked it up and turned to the first readable entry. It wasn't Ben's handwriting. It was messy, frantic. The first words were, "If you're reading this, you're not supposed to be here." The pages that followed were a tangle of observations, desperate speculations, names and numbers, Notes about patterns, questions like, "Why do they reset the clocks?" and "Why does it smell like bleach near the west fence?" But the most chilling entries were the ones about the children, names that didn't match any residents Andrew had met. Dozens of them. Many followed by a single word, circled in red: removed. The last page held only one phrase, written in pencil so hard it had torn the paper: "They don't let you leave. They just let you forget." Andrew sat in the dark, notebook pressed to his chest, wondering how long this had been going on. Years, decades. Was Lamont Hills just one of many? Was it even on the map anymore? The silence outside was no longer peaceful. It was curated, controlled. The following morning, Andrew tried to leave. He packed what little he could carry, including the notebook, a change of clothes, a burner phone, and the keys to his truck. He drove to the main road, but when he reached the exit of the neighborhood, a single traffic sign blocked the path. Not a detour sign. Not construction. Just a white board with a single word printed in red: redirecting. Behind it, the street appeared intact, but no matter how long he waited, the landscape beyond shimmered faintly in the heat like a mirage. He turned around and tried another route. The same sign. The same shimmer. Every GPS app he opened rebooted after 2 seconds. The radio played only one station now. A woman's voice, slow and calm, reading what sounded like legal text in a language he didn't recognize. He returned home by noon, shaking. That afternoon, the front door was painted. Not just the surface, the entire thing replaced, hinges and all. It was now white with a centered emblem, a perfect gray circle with an equilateral triangle inside. He hadn't heard them do it. He hadn't seen them do it. It was just done. On the welcome mat lay another envelope. This one bore no seal, no official font. Inside was a handwritten note, printed in fine cursive. "You've done well, Mr. Grayson. Compliance is a process. Resistance is a phase. The system thanks you for your engagement. Your contribution is noted." That night his bedroom window wouldn't open. Not stuck, not jammed, sealed, as if it had never been designed to open at all. Andrew no longer bothered locking the doors, not because he had grown complacent, but because he knew now that locks were performative. Nothing kept them out. They came and went as they pleased, always unseen, always one step ahead. What mattered now was time, how much of it he had left, and whether it could be spent with any purpose before the place consumed him entirely. The illusion of choice had long since collapsed, and the days had started to blur in a colorless haze of identical routines and synthetic calm. Yet somewhere inside that engineered monotony, a final, sharp thought had taken root and refused to be dulled. Ben was still alive. And if there was any humanity left in either of them, Andrew had to find a way to reach the boy before whatever they called Phase 2 finished dismantling who he was. That certainty became the axis around which Andrew now turned. His actions sharpened. He began watching patterns again, like he had in the early days: delivery vehicles, security rotations, the flicker of lights that didn't match the weather. He discovered that at 2:11 a.m., each night the grid briefly dropped for less than 3 seconds. During that moment, motion sensors paused, cameras blinked, and doors unlocked, perhaps as part of a reset cycle or a data sync. The first time he tested it, he stood in the dark hallway outside the committee office, pressing his palm gently against the entry latch, and at the exact moment the system stuttered. The door gave way under his hand. No alarms, no voices. Just the soft hiss of climate control and the silence of authorization. Inside, the building had changed. The glass rooms were gone. Now there were halls lined with mirrored panels, impossible to see through, all directionality erased. But Andrew followed instinct, not logic, and he moved fast, guided by something deeper than memory. He reached the lower level by a service stairwell. then turned left instead of right, passing through 2 unmarked doors until he entered a narrow space filled with metal beds, each one empty except for the faint indentations of small bodies that had once lain there. At the far end, a door stood ajar. He stepped through, and there he was. Ben sat on a bench in the middle of a room shaped like a hexagon, knees pulled to his chest, hands balled tight around a dull plastic toy shaped like a sphere. He looked up when Andrew entered, but his eyes did not light up. He blinked once, mechanically, as if registering a variable rather than recognizing a person. Andrew knelt in front of him, speaking his name slowly, carefully, like it was something fragile. For a moment, nothing changed. Then Ben whispered, barely audible, "You're not supposed to be here." Andrew almost laughed, not out of amusement but from the unbearable sadness of hearing his nephew repeat the same phrase the notebook boy had written weeks earlier. But he didn't lose control. He reached forward and gently took Ben's hand, guiding it away from the toy, holding it between his own. "We're leaving," he said, not asking, just stating it, as if saying it enough times would make it real. Ben didn't argue. He just stood, slowly, shakily. Together, they turned back toward the hallway, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Andrew believed it might actually work. They made it 3 corridors before the lights changed. Not brighter, not flashing, just a soft, low shift into a dull, violet hue that bled across the walls like bruised skin. A voice, disembodied and calm, echoed through the intercom. "Unauthorized withdrawal in progress. Participants will be detained for recalibration." Andrew didn't stop. He gripped Ben's hand tighter and ran. But at the next corner, they were waiting. Not guards, residents. Lorraine, Harold, even the coffee cup man, all standing shoulder to shoulder in a row, blocking the exit like human furniture. Their faces were calm, their eyes unfocused. They said nothing, moved not at all. Ben froze beside Andrew, breathing shallowly. Behind them, more footsteps. Soft, synchronized. The corridor pulsed with heat. Then a voice, unmistakable, rang out, measured, polished, and maddeningly neutral. The suited man. "Mr. Grayson, what have you gained?" Andrew turned slowly, putting himself between Ben and the sound. "You've taken everything from him. You think this is stability?" The man emerged from the shadows, arms outstretched like a man welcoming old friends to dinner. "You misunderstand. We didn't take. We preserved. Benjamin was fracturing. Fear, grief, confusion. We gave him structure, predictability, peace." Andrew shook his head. "You gave him a script." The man didn't blink. "Wouldn't you rather live in a story you understand than in chaos you can't fix?" Andrew took a step back, gauging the line of bodies blocking the hall. They weren't armed, they weren't aggressive, but they wouldn't let him pass. He turned to Ben and whispered something too quietly to hear, then knelt, met his eyes, and said it louder, "Do you trust me?" Ben nodded. Not much, but enough. Andrew turned, raised his hand slowly, and faced the suited man. "Then let me stay." The words were jagged in his throat, but he said them. "Let him go. I'll stay. I'll participate. You win." The man studied him, then nodded once. "Compliance noted." At that, the lights returned to white. The line of residents parted. Ben was led away by the girl with the clipboard, quietly, obediently, still holding the toy sphere. Andrew didn't call out, didn't beg. He just watched, expressionless, as the boy disappeared down the hall. Then he sat on the floor, alone, in the corridor of the machine. The days that followed did not feel like days at all, but like an endless suspension in a place where clocks no longer ticked and sunlight lost its rhythm. Andrew became part of the framework, folded seamlessly into the routine he had once resisted. They did not restrain him or cage him. Instead, they enveloped him with processes, checklists, and modules that flowed together until he could no longer distinguish where one ended and the next began. Each morning began with affirmation readings, each afternoon with monitored labor tasks, each evening with reflective reports written in a language that was slowly erasing the words he once used to think of himself as separate. At first, he repeated everything mechanically, aware of the artifice, still clutching the memory of why he was there, still repeating Ben's name silently like a charm against assimilation. But gradually, imperceptibly, he felt the edges blur. The resistance cost energy, and the system did not fight him with force. It simply outlasted him with patience. He saw Ben once more, though only from across a courtyard where children played in orchestrated patterns under the violet-tinged lights of dusk. The boy looked healthier, calmer, no trace of the grief or fear that had shadowed him when he first arrived. He didn't call out, didn't break formation, but as their eyes briefly met, Andrew thought he saw recognition, faint but undeniable, like a flicker of a candle behind glass. That was enough. It had to be enough. He had bought the boy's release, and even if the freedom was curated and conditional, it was a freedom Andrew himself no longer possessed. The neighborhood outside continued as always. Lawns trimmed, houses gleaming, the illusion intact for anyone who might stumble across it, though Andrew suspected no one ever did. Life in Lamont Hills moved on without pause, a perfect loop where people smiled at the right times and silence filled the spaces between. And within that loop, Andrew remained, no longer fighting, no longer asking, only existing as a part of the design. In the rare moments when his thoughts cleared, when memory surged sharp enough to hurt, he wondered if Ben would remember him as he was before, or if one day the boy would wake in some other place, some other neighborhood, believing the story had always been this way. He wondered if that would be kinder. And then the thought would dissolve, replaced by the script, and the system would continue.